My name is Nuno, and this is the Reform Review. We have a lot to cover this weekend, involving some stories that came up in last week's talk, and some new news of the week, but also some updates on different reforms that are going through to the House this coming week. We have some clear details on what's going to be happening. And I'm happy to say we have two amazing guests on this weekend to really talk about how does immigration reform affect our state governments. Now to start, we're going to pick up on a news topic that came up last week. I'll be sharing an article here talking about how the Biden administration has dropped their defense of the public charge rule from the Trump administration. If you are familiar with the public charge rule, it was a rule instituted by the Trump administration, or rather, it was changed to further punish any immigrant, even if they're legal immigrants here in the country, who would use public resources or services that they were granted. So this included different health insurance access and even food stamps would be held against them in the process to change their status to that of a U.S. citizen. Now, what happened was that the Biden administration was actually being called to court following that this was already in court under the Trump administration. And now they have formally come to an agreement with the other organizations who launched this lawsuit under the Trump administration to finally dismiss it before the U.S. Supreme Court. If you were following the Facebook page of ours, Citizenship 2021, you'd be familiar with this because we did share it, and it's amazing news because this means that the injunction that was blocking the rule from being implemented is now going to be permanent and upheld by the court, since now it's been formally dismissed. They're upholding the lower court's decision to block it. So what this means is, since the Biden administration had already put in an order to review the rule, we're expecting that this rule should be formally and permanently removed within the next few weeks. We're not 100% clear on how long it will take, but considering, as you can see here, I'll share the screen a little bit more clearly so you can see this, is that the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has already said that continuing to defend the rule is neither in the public interest nor an efficient use of limited government resources. So this is why we have a clear understanding that this will not last and it will be removed shortly. So again, very great news, and I think it was a very great way to have good news in the middle of the week to have received. Now we're going to go on to the next topic, which involves ICE. So that their recent report has shown that arrests and deportations have actually gone down by upwards of 60% in this past month. So this is an article from the Washington Post. They may report it 100% accurately. Sometimes they have a little bit of a skew, but we're going to take the facts as they come. Now, some of the important takeaways from this, I would say, is that yes, the internal reports from ICE do show that the numbers of deportations from ICE have gone down substantially. As you can see here, I've highlighted it, that it has gone down. The internal numbers show that October, November, December, so those last 3 months of the Trump administration, we saw an average of 6,800 arrests from ICE. However, now in February, so this real past month, we've only seen 2,500. So it is a significant drop in the number of arrests. So it's okay news, but I also want to caution that it's not fantastic news to be celebrating over. The truth of the matter is that ICE is still functioning as ever. They're out arresting and deporting thousands of immigrants each month. So yes, we are going down and dipping in the number, but it is not any indication that ICE will stop or have really concrete priorities. It's still up to their discretion for the most part. The Biden administration did put out different priorities, focusing more on violent crimes, gang members. Again, it's still up to discretion for the individual ICE officers. Now, another thing to note is, as it says here, is that ICE arrests and deportations also generally fell dramatically during the pandemic, for the different reasons that ICE wants to make sure that their officers are protected from possible COVID infection, but also the general trend with immigration detention centers throughout the country is that capacity has sharply decreased to avoid potential outbreaks in these detention centers. This does not mean that the immigrants in the detention centers are getting improved care or that they're actually having a much better time under the Biden administration while in detention. There's still underlying issues that need to be resolved. So definitely take this kind of dip in arrests and deportations with a grain of salt. The other thing to keep in mind is, as it says here, and I'm shocked that this is not getting as much outrage as it should, is that the Biden administration, and I covered this actually some weeks ago in a different report, is that the Biden administration continues to use a Trump-era policy using COVID as a public health excuse to expedite the deportation of different immigrants at the border. As it says here, it's allowing them to rapidly return most migrants to Mexico or even to Haiti, using COVID again as that primary excuse. So they have not removed it. They have not made an indication that they are planning to change it in any way. And so these are the small facts that need to be addressed and recognize that, yes, things are marginally better than they were under Trump. That's perfectly fine. But there are still policies being used from the Trump era, which justifiably raised a lot of outrage among the public that are now being ignored under the Biden administration. So definitely we need to be careful going forward, make sure we're paying attention to what's happening and acting accordingly. But overall, again, ICE arrests down 60%. I think that's still something to be happy about, but not to be complacent with. The next topic we're going to be talking about involves the U.S. border, once again. This is another topic we covered in last week's report. However, things have not gotten better. If anything, they've actually gotten a little bit worse since we've last spoken about this. So at the U.S. border, if you're unfamiliar with what is happening, is that there is a crisis of unaccompanied minors coming to the border and overwhelming the resources available to properly provide them shelter and to then process them through the system. As you can see here, more than 3,200 unaccompanied migrant children have been in custody from this past Monday. And the thing to consider is that, around 2,600 of them were placed into shelters that were appropriate for them, because they do have a distinction between ones for adults, some for families, and some for minors. And within those shelters, there were only 500 beds for 2,600 children. And so this is to the point that the resources that are available and the capacity to house these children is marginally lower than what is actually necessary for a humane treatment. Now, what else to consider here is these points right here. There's plenty of outrage back when the Trump administration began this. And again, it's not to deflect any responsibility from the Trump administration. The crisis at the southern border is large in part due to the policies that the Trump administration passed and implemented and enforced. So they are not free from any responsibility from this. However, it is to say that the Biden administration needs to act faster, because as you can see here, comparing it to 2019, when we had the last big reports of a crisis at the border, humanitarian issue, that was there were only around 2,600 unaccompanied minors at the border in custody. Now again, we're well over 3,000, and the pace, the rate that this is getting out of hand, for just a brief example, is that back in a week before, they were only at 1,700, so a little bit manageable. But only a week after we hit over 3,200. And so there's such a significant growth in the number of children coming to the border that the Biden administration needs to act faster to properly house them, provide them some kind of shelter and protection while they're waiting for their cases to be processed, and also investing into the process so they can be transferred out and placed in a more humane condition with a foster family or with a family member in the U.S. To this point, that is exactly what the Biden administration is trying to do. There were some policy changes under the Trump administration, of course, where they required that the Department of Health and Human Services, the department which is actually transferring these children around and making sure that they get to a family to care for them, would require information about family sponsors with immigration authorities. So this really did discourage a greater number of families coming forward to sponsor these children. So now the Biden administration is aiming to roll that back, to re-implement more friendly and humane practices to make sure that these kids are able to go through the process in a much faster way and meeting the actual requirements by law. Right now, they're supposed to only stay roughly around 20 days, but the average is upwards of 31, 37 days that they're being held in detention rather than being processed. So this remains to be seen what will happen with it. There's other changes down here. You can see that they will now be implementing a process that Trump had ended, where children in Central America will actually be able to apply for legal status to the U.S. Without having to make the journey all the way to the southern border. The benefit of this is that the journey itself is very, very dangerous. It's hazardous and causes the death of many, many people trying to make it to the U.S. border. So this opportunity will allow children who are in need, who are in danger in their country, to apply for legal status and then come to the U.S. to be with family members who are already here. So this is, again, a brilliant way of helping to alleviate the crisis at the border, especially since so many unaccompanied minors are coming. The issue, again, is that there's also been a sharp increase overall across the board, children and families. That increased 100%, so really doubling in such a short period of time between January and February. So at the change of administration from Trump to Biden, we saw such a spike. And again, unaccompanied children rose 60% to an overall number of 9,400. So the situation at the border is definitely complicated, and it needs a lot of nuanced response to effectively help these children who are in need. And to that point, this is not helping. This is related, but definitely concerning in itself, is that Republican representatives are definitely jumping to take advantage of this crisis at the border to try and force stricter regulations, policy on immigrants, so a way to punish immigrants overall using this sort of explosion at the border. So what's happening, I want to cover this, and this will be related to our talk later in the day, where this is the governor of Texas, a Republican. He is Governor Greg Abbott. He recently, I'm sure many of you have heard this, removed the regulations around COVID to protect the general public, so mask wearing, and has reopened the state in all of its into 100% capacity in different restaurants, businesses. And so he has done this in response to pressure from other conservative members in his state telling him to just open up the economy, which he did. And now he has quickly turned to blaming immigrants as a risk for transmission of the virus, and that will be the cause of the spike, not his decision to reopen the state. And so this is a common trend throughout history. This shouldn't be surprising for many people who are familiar with the way immigrants have been painted in the past through a narrative. So in many times in history, immigrants have been described as being sort of vectors of disease, that they're a threat to the general health of the country and security of the country. So this is not a uncommon explanation from the governor, from our conservative members and representatives. The issue is that this is kind of gaining steam. It is being used as a way to push back on many of these policies that allow for immigrants to be placed throughout the state and throughout the country instead of being held in permanent detention, really, which was common under the Trump administration and even going back towards the Obama administration. So just to put it out very clearly, there is no evidence to support that migrants coming in at the border are going to be these vectors of disease and spreading COVID and infecting others. If anything, as this article from the Associated Press points out, the infection rates among many of these migrants is much lower than the infection rates in the general population of these border towns. For example, in Brownsville, I believe it's around 10%, the mayor has confirmed, while in the immigrant population, those who are coming in and being processed, it's a little under 6%. So it is already averaging below. And those who are infected, and just to put out the process very clearly, they are isolated, they're separated, and then they're processed through quarantine and made sure that they're fine going forward. Now, the other thing to point out is Governor Abbott has already denied or rejected an offer for support from the federal government, from the Biden administration, to support the process of testing the migrants coming in, isolating them, and quarantining them where necessary. He has already said that it's a federal issue, but he's refusing to sign off on the permission that the federal government needs to be able to enter and provide as much support as possible to these migrants. So we'll talk about this soon enough with our guests, of just what the role is of state representatives when it comes to immigration reform, but also to the immigrant population, those seeking help, those seeking asylum in this country, because the state governments have such an influence, especially when they're on these border states. But for now, this remains to be seen. Again, there's no evidence supporting that these migrants, and especially these children, would be spreading COVID at an increased rate. It is definitely a scare tactic used to push stricter enforcement on these migrant populations. So do keep that in mind. And we'll be following this very closely just to see where it develops, and hopefully the Biden administration stays strong and does not give in to a lot of these conservative talking points. So those three are really the main news of the week. The rest of the news is really in the matter of the reform that's coming to the House this coming week. I want to quickly share on my screen two different things. First is this article explaining sort of the Democratic leadership's idea of where they're going with in terms of possible reform. So it seems most likely, as it says here, Majority Leader Steny Hoyer, he has already announced that they will be reviewing two bills this coming week, and I'll show you his tweet. It's actually here. They're hoping to try and pass that deadlock in the Senate by going this route to support bipartisan bills that have already passed the House in the last congressional session. Now, how they're going to do this is they're aiming to have these bills passed through a more normal way, so just passing it through the House once again, bringing it to the Senate, and if it were to go down that way, they are also considering budget reconciliation as a way to avoid having to get a 60 vote margin from the Republican Party, because they would need 10 Republicans to support any kind of reform to actually have it passed in this normal way. Now, what will happen if they go through budget reconciliation is that they only need their 50 senators, Democratic senators, to vote yes, and then the Vice President Kamala Harris will vote as a tiebreaker in support. My one issue with this route is that it does seem that they are abandoning the U.S. Citizenship Act, which again is a comprehensive reform bill. It would not only help Dreamers or TPS holders or agricultural workers, but it will help all undocumented immigrants in the country. So over 11 million immigrants who need this kind of support and relief. So it will remain to be seen what happens with the U.S. Citizenship Act going forward. I'll speak a little bit more on it in its own section, but it definitely does seem that it is most likely to be abandoned going on. So to start off, I do again want to bring up the U.S., or rather the DREAM Act of 2021. Not much to share, unfortunately. And again, if you always have questions, feel free to leave them in the comments. I review them after and I look up and do some more research to make sure everything's correct. But to my awareness, the DREAM Act of 2021, the standalone bill to help dreamers, has not made any progress. It's not received any more support in the Senate, so no more co-sponsors. Yeah, my one explanation for this is that it does seem that the House leadership, so the Democrats, are more focused on the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021 and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021. So these two bills that are coming up for a vote, they are more focused on these two rather than on, say, the DREAM Act of 2021. So do keep that in mind. It does not mean that this bill is going to die, that it's going to be abandoned, although it may be sitting in committee for quite a while until Democratic leadership pick it back up. But do keep that in mind. Next up is, again, as I was mentioning, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. You'll read it down there, but just to explain to you that we're still under the assumption that House Democrats and Senate Democrats will be sending this off to the House Judiciary Committee and the Senate Judiciary Committees for the review to be marked up and then eventually introduced into both the House and Senate formally for a vote, or hopefully for a vote. We're not 100% clear on whether or not they're going to even continue down this route if they keep on breaking up the reform into pieces and then pushing it. Again, as I always say, it's great to have some reform happen, help as many people as we can, but what we are looking for is comprehensive reform for all immigrants in the country so that they all receive dignity and respect going forward. So please keep that in mind. We need to fight for the U.S. Citizenship Act. While it's great that we can get support for Dreamers, support for TPS holders, and those who have deferral for enforcement and deportation, great, but we don't want to leave the rest of the community behind. That is the most important point to speak about here. Do not make it about one community versus another portion of the community. We had to be able to help everyone through this together. So as this develops, I'll of course bring more updates on it. And if you have more questions, feel free to leave it in the comments and we'll be able to answer it in time. But more importantly, we'll talk a little bit about these two together. So I know it's a lot and a little bit smaller font here, but I do want to pair them together because as you'll see here, I'll bring up this. This is from the Majority Leader, House Majority Leader, Steny Hoyer, as I had kind of slightly mentioned him earlier. This is a tweet from him, and I'll just read it out loud to you real quick. Following a productive week in the House, including passing the American Rescue Plan, the PRO Act, and legislation to address gun violence, I look forward to bringing these important priorities to the floor next week. Next week being this week that is coming up, the week of the 15th of March. So what do they have for this week? Well, you can see here a couple of different things, but more importantly in our regard, all these are definitely important, but you have the Dream and Promise Act and the Farm Workforce Modernization Act. So these two that we're talking about right now, they are coming up for a vote this week. One article puts it that they may even be coming up as early as the 15th. So on Monday, it may be that the case that they are going to be voted on then. If you check the roster here for bills to be considered, right? So week of the 15th, just to confirm that this is true from that tweet, you scroll down here, and there it is, H.R. 6, which is the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021, and H.R. 1603, Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021. My little banner here is slightly incorrect then, so pardon me for getting the bill number for the Farm Workforce Modernization Act incorrect there. It should be, as it says here, H.R. 1603 if you were to search it. So I'll make that correction in a second. But that is really the update on these two particular bills. They are going to come up for a vote this week, which is amazing news. We're hoping for the best. Again, any reform is great, but we do want to prefer the comprehensive reform over just this piecemeal approach. It is something telling that the Biden administration, as we covered last week, has taken their hands off on the entire process. They are not fighting for this reform. They're not even fighting for their own bill. This is the bill that President Biden proposed to Congress. It is his immigration reform, and he is not even fighting for it. So, with that in mind, it's no surprise that House Democrat leaders are also abandoning a comprehensive approach. They're not going to fight for it. Instead, they're taking the easy way out and saying, hey, we're helping as many people as we can. We've done our part. It's the Republicans' fault. Now we can move on with the rest of our lives. Don't complain. We've seen this strategy used throughout time and time again. And so we need to be able to organize and take a stand going forward, making sure that our representatives know that we're watching and that we are expecting them to fight and keep their promises. Now, normally I will go into a lot more details about how you can take action, but I will keep that off more so towards the end because I do want to give some time to prep to invite our guest on. So in just a minute, we'll be right back. And then we'll really go into the guest section of this day to answer the question of how does immigration reform affect our state governments. And again, that is with our guest from the Washington People's Party. It's Marc Mixon and Jamin Mason, both state coordinators from the Washington People's Party, and we're very proud to have them. So we'll be right back in a minute, and then we hope you enjoyed the show, really. So give us just 1 second, and we'll be right back. Hello, and yeah, we're back to start our guest portion of the Reform Review today. Again, the question we're going to be talking about is how does immigration reform affect our state governments? So again, very, very proud to have two amazing guests on. We have, I'll start actually introducing our guest. I'll start with Jamin Mason. He was born and raised in Port Orchard, Washington. He grew up living in different foster homes and was actually expelled from different public schools he attended. He spent a portion of his youth incarcerated at juvenile or adult institutions. However, after initial diagnosis in 2001 about having multiple sclerosis and this worsening in 2010, Jamin began to seek out ways to change his life, especially after his own daughter began to show early signs of a similar life path. After being inspired by the Movement for a People's Party and even by comedian Jimmy Dore, for those who are familiar with him, Jamin has been an advocate for criminal justice reform, increased rights for the disabled community, and for working people in the state of Washington and beyond. So he now serves as one of the state coordinators of the Washington People's Party and also sits on several of these state committees. So we're very thankful to have Jamin on. And equally, we invite and we welcome Marc Mixon. and his background is also very interesting. So, like many others, he had a rough start in his education. He did not graduate high school right away and had to go back to get his GED a year later. However, he did go on to receive an associate's degree and received his bachelor's degree in theater 7 years later. And he even got a MFA, some kind of master's, I believe, correct? I've not heard of MFA before, so pardon me on that. But it was in production design and technology 9 years after he got his bachelor's. Regularly, Marc has worked as a daily laborer in food service, retail, and construction. Later, he spent 10 years in state service, primarily as a fiscal analyst for the Washington State Department of Transportation. Overall, he is a working person, currently working as a union stagehand, theatrical carpenter and electrician, freelance designer, and educational theater. He is motivated to create change for the working people of Washington and throughout the whole country. He is also, again, a state coordinator for the Washington People's Party. So again, thank you to the two of you for being here. I'm very, very happy to have you on. If the two of you want to give the audience a quick hi, feel free to do so.
Well, hello, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for having us on, Nuno. I've really enjoyed the show, the episodes I've heard, and I'm happy to be here.
And again, I am Jamin Mason, co-coordinator for the Washington People's Party. And I could not be more pleased to learn more, first of all, about immigration and where we're going from here, where we need to go from here. It's been enlightening, and I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone here.
Perfect. And I'm sure everyone is excited to hear what you have to add in. So to start, again, just a reminder, we're here to talk about how does immigration reform affect our state governments. And just to help keep track, we will have different questions. The main question running across the bottom, and some guiding questions will be prompted on the screen just for our viewers also to keep track of what we're talking about and focusing on at that moment. Now, to start off, I think we really want to hit on how important immigration reform really is. And under constitutional law, it is supposed to be a federal issue, right? So it is the federal government that has complete control over our immigration policies. However, it's becoming abundantly clear that state governments also have some influence on immigration and its policies, and how do we actually interact with the immigrant community. For example, if our audience remembers, earlier on I was talking about the governor of Texas and his strong stance to blame immigrants for the spread of COVID in Texas, even if he is making his own decisions on completely opening up the economy of the state. So maybe I want to just open it up, maybe starting with you, Marc, if you'd like to begin. So in what ways is immigration reform not just a federal issue? How is it involved in the state level?
It's a good and complex question, right? When we talk about immigration reform as far as the states are concerned, what we often start talking about is like the cost of immigration on the state. And really, you'll hear, and I wish I could say it was just conservative politicians, but you'll hear politicians on both sides talk about how immigrants, whether they're documented or undocumented, how immigrants writ large will cost the state money. They will cost us in education is one they talk about a lot, but in healthcare, in insurance, in our prison system, our criminal punishment system. And all of it is obfuscation, really, because part of both sides, both parties tend to use immigration as a tool to protect capital and to help criminalize those who are the least fortunate in our society. States, it's an issue for us as opposed to just a federal one, because, the immigrant community is a part of every state's community, quite frankly. There's nothing magical about being born 1 mile to the north or 1 mile to the south, for example, right? That makes one person intrinsically valuable and one person intrinsically not. There is a lot of things that there's a lot of value judgments, I guess, is the shortest way to say it, that our government takes, politicians of both parties take, about who and what has value in the society and who and what does not. And they like to keep working people divided. They like to keep us distracted and not working together outside of solidarity, so that some groups, and I feel immigrant groups, our immigrant communities are falling prey to this often as well. Like there's a narrative started, well, I don't know when it started in my consciousness with Bill Clinton's administration, where we began really being tough on crime and tough on the bad immigrants. And that continued through, and I won't even talk about Republican administrations, because they obviously use fear-mongering of incoming, quote, aliens, people that they can characterize as different. And you will notice that, but it is bipartisan. It is a bipartisan issue whereby groups of immigrants are categorized as bad, and even the good ones are mistrusted, right? If you look at, and I'm embarrassed, I'm not familiar with the details of Mr. Biden's suggested plans. Because quite frankly, 40 years in office has told me that Mr. Biden lies about his plans, and he has no intention of following through with whatever he said he was going to do. But I am willing to bet. I'm willing to bet that there is a long period of time between how you apply for the program and call it years before you hit the next step, and years before you hit the next step. And if I had to guess, there's a lot of minor infractions that can count enough to disqualify you. There's just a very long period of time to make sure that you have the opportunity as an immigrant in our nation to be criminalized. And I bet there's litmus tests to make sure that you know more than natural-born citizens about how this country works, and about the rules that govern it, and about how our scenario is set up, and to make sure that you, English language is a great litmus test that both people like to have. Like that communities must, they don't belong here if they refuse to learn our language. And sorry, I'm gonna slow down. I'm gonna slow down. I get very, very worked up. So I'm gonna say that I think there's lots of ways that that state government impacts immigration. I think there's a lot of ways immigration impacts us, especially in an agricultural state like Washington, that has so much agricultural export and has so many itinerant workers. That there's lots of ways that state governments can make a choice to prioritize humanity over items, people over capital, and that we can make decisions in a state to treat people with dignity and respect, regardless of their documented status, regardless of whether they have the papers that the government wants everyone to be holding at any time they get stopped or not. So I'm going to, saying that, I'm going to try to pass the mic and listen to someone else for a moment and wet my way.
Now, it's very passionate, and I think it's appreciated. This is really what we would hope many of our current representatives would be saying when they're in their position of power. So actually, then I think I'll kind of ask Jamin to maybe build on a couple of those ideas then, really focusing on, the question again, in what ways is immigration reform not just a federal issue, right? What areas in state governance or policy is touched upon by immigration reform, or the immigrant community in general, if you prefer?
Yes, sir. Marc, I really appreciated your perspective. That was awesome. The following backgrounder provides explanations of the way the immigrants end up in local custody and are held there on the basis of their immigration status. It also explores the associated fiscal costs and increased detentions to states and countries. In recent years, police have increasingly been drawn into immigrants' local into immigration enforcement operation. And as a result of local jails are holding increased numbers of immigrants, even those not facing criminal charges. Detaining immigrants in the state or local custody creates additional costs and burdens of local law enforcement agencies. And the unnecessary and prolonged detention of immigrants costs local budgets millions of taxpayers' dollars. So, coming from the background that I've been from, I've seen a lot of that. I'd be in jail, and they would bring immigrants in. Now, they treated prisoners bad, but you could see they treated immigrants even worse. And so that always struck a real negative chord in my body. They're humans just like an immigrant is a human just like us. I believe we should all be treated with dignity and love and compassion. I was talking earlier with Nuno, like, in my opinion, there shouldn't even be prisons. It should be an open terrain. I mean, not to say there's not punishments for doing people wrong, but to say, oh, this prisoner is treated this way, but we're going to treat these prisoners even worse because they're not from this country. It's just so backwards, like everything about that. And I think, again, this will come up a couple of times. It's a money thing. It's people like passing the buck, or let's pass this down the road. And it's really sad because, like I said, these people are humans just like me. It don't matter where they're born. They deserve the dignity, and they deserve to stand upright and have a place in this world just like anybody else, where they're not being taken advantage of, or just because they grew up in this place, they have to live in horrible conditions their whole life. Like, in my opinion, let them come here, let them create a life in the land where anything can happen. America is supposed to be the land of opportunities. Let anyone come here and do that. All of us smiling is how the world continues in a positive way.
I think you brought up a good point earlier, Jamin, about sort of the role of sort of even local law enforcement on sort of the enforcement of the greater federal immigration policies. Right? I remember a couple of years back when Trump was first took power. There was quite a push among states to make sanctuary cities and these different sanctuary policies to prevent local law enforcement to work with ICE, because that was a growing issue where ICE was sort of deputizing, and to an extent, local law enforcement to act as immigration officers, even though it shouldn't be possible, since again, it's the boundary between federal enforcement and local enforcement was starting to get blurred. So it's not uncommon, definitely not uncommon for the federal policy to start itching its way into the local side, even not even just at the state side. What comes to my mind, especially because we did cover quite a bit on the criminal justice side, right, for detention, even how some states will set up private detention centers to take in even more immigrants. And so the moral question of private detention is also up for debate. But in my own experience, I really focused on higher education access to that, because what you see is a very big debate among whether or not state governments can even provide different benefits like in-state tuition to undocumented immigrants, or say financial aid to undocumented immigrants. And this is a big issue for even dreamers who've come here at a young age, live their whole lives in the U.S., and yet they're prevented from having the same access to education as their classmates. I'm not sure if the two of you are familiar with the history of public education, here for undocumented immigrants. But just a very quick quick summary before I kind of open up this question to the two of you is that all children in the U.S. are required to receive public education, so K through not K through, but what would be basically from first grade all the way through high school to their graduation. But then it kind of cuts off there. It was a Supreme Court decision, Plyler v. Doe, some years ago, that led to that decision that state governments cannot prevent even undocumented immigrants, so undocumented children, from receiving a public education. And that any laws that try and infringe on that, such as document checks for parents, like to check if their parents are also legal, that would be struck down by this decision to make sure that they can receive an education just like any other child. So there is some precedent in the past, but it does seem, in my opinion, that there is a preference for a type of immigrants in this country, and typically being young immigrants being brought to this country and then they live their life here. Whereas those who are 18 years of age or older, if they didn't go through any process in the U.S., they're really isolated and broken away from any resources that would be available to them if they had just been brought to the U.S. a little bit earlier on. So my question really for the two of you, and I'll maybe open up to either of you who want to start off on it, is, why do we have this sort of like preference in certain kinds of immigrants? We slightly touched on it. You were mentioning about, I believe it was you, Marc, started kind of hitting on it about how there's good immigrants, bad immigrants. There's a certain distinction. So maybe you want to talk a little bit about this, of where does this narrative or where does this preference for certain kinds of immigrants come from?
Sure. I mean, the easy answer is racism. Quite frankly, it's a way to enforce the caste system in the U.S. The reason we prefer, we being the American people, the American government, politicians of both parties particularly, prefer you to come younger is because then you can be indoctrinated. If you are older, you will have already absorbed some of your own culture, and God forbid you hold any culture have value other than the American culture, right? The earlier you can be indoctrinated, the earlier you can believe in the American values and the American system, the more valuable you are. So there's that perspective. And then of course there's the perspective of value to, I hate to use the words, I don't want to say hot button, but the capitalist system, right? Everyone, it becomes nearly a joke when you call capitalism the responsibility of a lot of our ills. But the fact is, if you can differentiate immigrants between those who are providing value to our existing capitalist system and those who will put a financial burden on our existing capitalist system, if you use that lens, you will find exactly the divisions that they use to categorize the good immigrants versus the bad immigrants, right? And people who have worked really hard to improve their lives and improve the lives for their families, and come to this country through enormous hardship and struggles that natural-born citizens cannot imagine. It is very hard to hear that there are good and there are bad. And you want to, as someone who has struggled and risked to provide for your family, you want to be good. You want to be one of the good citizens, one of the good aliens, one of the good residents. You want to be the good immigrant. You don't want to be, like Trump said, how did he word it? They're not bringing their best, they're sending their murderers and their rapists, and I don't know what he said. But it's part of the same narrative. It's the same narrative that Obama had with the tough on crime and categorizing. How did Obama word it? It was he was going to be deporting the worst of the worst, right? Those are the words he said. And then if you look in practice about how deportations increased and how the worst of the worst started being, and Nuno, I'm sure you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but started being categorized by like a number of misdemeanors. If you hit a threshold, now you're the worst of the worst, and you get sent away. And the end result of this categorization, and let's just take a step back and recognize that this type of categorization, and especially with regard to our Latinx, I think, immigrants, something that started far earlier in our racial caste system, when the Nixon administration perhaps began to implement the Southern strategy, sort of in a larger context, and it's about categorizing those that have value and don't. And sorry, every time I start getting really distracted about capitalism, I get really I get really angry and distracted.
It's perfectly
refresh me on what I started ranting on, Nuno, and I will wrap it up better.
Well, one thing I want to kind of pick up on of what you were saying is along the lines of, again, right, the picture perfect immigrant that people need to be, right? It's not that you don't have to want to be it, but it's required by law. Part of what I covered in a previous show, when we were really going into the details of what bills are coming up, for example, the American Dream and Promise Act. Funnily enough, as you were saying about sort of having different expectations of knowledge of even civics here in the U.S., one of the requirements for that bill would be for a dreamer, so again, young immigrant who came to this country, to be not only fluent in English, right, to have a strong background in English, being able to write it, understand it, but also to need to be able to know about the American government, about different aspects of the policy, sort of like things that you wouldn't really not really expected of the typical U.S. citizen is put on top of these migrant children. I mean, they might not even be children by this point, but they still qualify. There's a higher expectation of what does it mean to be a U.S. citizen for people who were not born here. So that's definitely something that's true, and it's reflected in a lot of these policies that are being pushed forward. And even for the good immigrant side of things is the requirement that you cannot have any felony whatsoever. So anyone with even one felony is automatically rejected from consideration for any of these relief bills. But on top of that is many of these ones that are bipartisan will come out with a requirement that even 3 or more misdemeanors, or sometimes even 2 or more misdemeanors of any kind, would be held against you, and you wouldn't be able to receive relief. So it's like walking a tightrope, a very thin line for a lot of migrants to be able to be considered to become, hopefully, eventually receive a pathway to citizenship. So definitely there is an image in mind when it comes to our representatives when they're crafting these bills of who deserves an opportunity to not have to worry about being picked up, detained, and then deported to a country that maybe they haven't even been to since they were, 1, 2, 3 years old. Talking about dreamers, per se. But even for those who are older, for example, my mom has been here for 30 years, and she came when she was, I believe, around 20 years old, roughly. So she's been in this country longer than she was raised in Mexico. So in her case, they'd be sending her back to a place that she's not seen for over a quarter of a century, and everything's different. She wouldn't know people there. The same people she grew up with won't be there. And so I'm sure there's other immigrants who are in this similar situation. Sorry, I almost knocked over my water. who would be, who run the risk of having their entire life upended just to be shipped away because they don't qualify in that perception of the deserving immigrant. So actually then, to you, Jamin, I do have a question. Maybe we can start turning this a little bit towards a different angle. More so focusing on a little bit that we were talking about earlier. We kind of hit on this topic slightly of different reasons of why do sort of party politics clash with immigration reform, right? Because I'll share something very quickly with you, right, the two of you, and with our audience, so they have this context. But as you can see here, right, for somehow immigration reform continues to be such a divisive issue when it comes to our representatives. But when you look, this is a poll by a Quinnipiac poll. So rather recent. So this is from February 3rd of this year, right? So in terms of Biden's actual proposal, so what we're talking about, the U.S. Citizenship Act for undocumented immigrants overall, it actually has, for dreamer population, I believe here is this first one. So this is about dreamer population, so young migrants who were brought to this country and then they grew up here. It has major support, so 83% support it and only 12% oppose it. Again, for children who were brought here and they grew up here. But also surprisingly, even those who are just living here, so not the dreamer population, 65% of Americans say that they should also receive some pathway to U.S. citizenship. Only 9% say that they should stay in the U.S. but not be able to receive citizenship, and 20% say they should just leave the U.S. So this isn't as much of a divisive issue as a lot of our conservative members try to argue when it comes to pathway citizenship. And even if we check earlier surveys, right, so this is from June 17th of 2020, so roughly a year ago, a little under a year ago, you see similar trends. So this is about overall, so general undocumented immigrants, you see 75% total of all voters say that they should have, 24% say no, and even when you see for those who are children, again, the dreamer population, similarly, 74% overall, 24% against. So this is a general trend that I just want to kind of raise here. When we're thinking about why do party politics clash with immigration reform, because when you look at where the population is, right, the general U.S. voter, that a lot of these conservative representatives say that when they oppose immigration reform, when they say that they're standing against it because it's not what their constituents want, but then you see these polls, it's conflicting. It's definitely not matching up with reality. So, Jamin, to start off with you, I just want to get your sense, right? Why do party politics clash so much with immigration reform, even if we're seeing these polls saying that there's so much support for something to come out, some pathways to citizenship? You'll have to unmute your mic.
Sorry about that. I would say, just like most things come back to, it's a money issue. Like these people, if you're not helping them make money, it all goes back to that. If you're costing them more money than you're making them, that would definitely be a huge thing on the. I mean, it's shown daily. Republicans, Democrats, whichever way it goes, it's about them making money and us, the working class, whether that be immigrants or people here working on visa cards, however that looks. If they're not making more money than they're handing out, it's not okay. So I would definitely stick to that rhetoric. They are on a checks and balance mission to where if they're not winning, and if immigrants coming to our place, regardless of how they feel and how much better that makes their lives or their quality of life being here in America, if the people at the top above us, if they're not making more money from that, if they're losing money, it's a negative in their eyes, period. And we see that in our daily lives on a daily basis. Kind of just like the stimulus check. They $2,000 gets cut down to 14. Even though we got told we were going to get $2,000, well, because they already gave us $600 previously, they're like, oh, well, we're going to give you $1,400 just pinching pennies is what that top 1% loves to do. And I believe that comes into play with immigration in a major way. You know, they'll take the migrant workers here to pay them cheaper and get that. But as soon as they have to pay them, you know, what's it called? The minimum wage, as soon as they have to pay them that, well, now it's costing them money. So we don't want the migrant workers because they're not working for $2 an hour anymore. They're, you know, it's a huge thing about, it's a huge game of money to me. And that's what makes me sick. You know, so that would be my opinion on that question.
I think it's definitely a factor in it. I think it's something that comes up quite frequently. And even when you look at the U.S. Citizenship Act, because it does have a pathway to citizenship for agricultural workers, which was something that surprised me, but it's no different than the Farm Workforce Modernization Act, which is coming up. But part of the arguments in favor of it is just that the provisions within the bill is making it life easier for the employer to go through the process of either petitioning for more visas to provide it more frequently, and also in general the ease of not having to worry about having these migrant workers potentially costing them different fees and penalties that they're working there. So, Marc, do you have anything to kind of like add on to that in terms of, again, why party politics clash with immigration reform?
Well, I mean, to add on, but really just to reinforce Jamin's point. I mean, why, in my opinion, why they clash is money. It's because even if a broad range of the American people supports some sort of path to citizenship, as of course I do, right? I'm not a statist or a nationalist. I believe that if you live here, if you are making your life here, you are my neighbor and you have an equal say as I do. But the fact is, for Democrats and Republicans both, voters, people, working people are not their constituents. Their constituents are the wealthy who have the money. Their constituents are capital. Capital is who is making the calls here. And so even though people, citizens, voters broadly accept that immigrants are here and helping our community and helping our society writ large. I mean, let's recognize no one on this call is an indigenous of this continent, the North American continent necessarily, right? So we're all immigrants at some level. Our families are, right? I don't know as much about Mexico, but I believe there as well, those of Spanish descent are valued more highly than those of indigenous descent. I feel like the indigenous populations of the Americas are broadly devalued. And if you want to look at where our system, and I'll use our system rather than capital or capitalism, what our system values, you look at who they criminalize. If you want to, there are two people at, quote, wrong when someone is hiring an undocumented worker. It is the undocumented worker for being present and wanting to work and earn money, and it is the employer for denying jobs to, quote, their citizens and hiring the undocumented workers. But I guarantee that the people who are penalized when that happens are the workers. The workers are the ones that are rounded up and punished or exported or deported, not the capitalists, not the bosses, right? If we as a society change the law so that hiring an undocumented worker meant a mandatory minimum sentence of a decade in general population prison for any CEO, wherever the buck stopped, whoever is ultimately responsible for the running of that organization, if hiring an undocumented worker meant that that person went to prison, I guarantee within a very short period of time, either no undocumented workers would be hired and they would have no way to make a living, or they would change the laws really damn quick. to make sure that that was okay to do suddenly. So it clashes with party politics, the immigration issue, not for anything in reality, but because party politics has spent generations demonizing immigrants and people of color as the other, so that we can make sure we have two teams of working class to fight against each other, while the ownership class continues to extract wealth and value from all of us. And and to make sure that we, racism, capitalism, they're just so intertwined. We could try to calm down. We could, as a society, show we valued people more than capital at a state level. For example, if we would stop allowing our policing, and I want to talk about policing, I'm going to make a quick note to talk about policing. If we would prioritize our policing away from the immigrant communities and not helping with ICE, which is the American Gestapo waiting to run roughshod over everyone, but if we would not be helping the deportation of our communities with the federal government, but would rather spend the same amount of money. Let's take immigration, path to citizenship, and education. Education is often one of the key steps in any sort of a program that we are going to allow immigrants to become citizens. Is they must educate themselves. They must be bettering themselves, right? So if we spent our money rather on creating outreach schools to help our itinerant communities, so that we spent the money that we currently spend criminalizing immigrants and helping the federal government, we took that same money and paid teachers to follow our itinerant communities through the harvest season, for example, up and down the West Coast, and make sure that their children could be in schools, that they could be in school, that their education program was an outreach program associated with an accredited institution, so that even though they did not have a home base because they are following the crop, for example, they can still be registering and getting credits and being enrolled in an educational program to find their path to citizenship. That's a way that we, states, could prioritize our money to benefit our immigrant communities and to make sure that they have a better path to citizenship. But instead, we take that money and we use it to criminalize the poor and criminalize the disadvantaged and help capital. Okay, so I'm gonna stop with that one. There's a couple of ways that state government could help our immigrant communities, and it's definitely a local issue as much as a federal issue, even though it is very federally. The laws are federal, but the implementation always happens with people and with communities and at the local level, I would say.
Right, and I think we all appreciate the passion too. So never have to apologize for getting into it when talking about this. But Jamin, do you have a point you want to add on to what Marc is bringing up?
Yes, just to add on to what Marc had said, no one can see my shirt, but it says all lives won't matter until Black lives do. So I get that, even being an American citizen, I get exactly where people coming from different countries, I get it, because even though I was born into this country, I'm just in their eyes, that 1%, I'm just as much of an immigrant as anyone else would be. I'm not, this isn't my land. And so I just wanted to say, like, we are all in this together. Whether you're from a different country, you're here on a visa, we are all here together. And the main point needs to be to make America great for the first time ever, because it's never been great for your people, for my people, for anyone's people, because it's their way or the highway. So I just really wanted to key in on that. And thanks for bringing that point up, Marc.
Definitely, and I kind of wanted to hit on sort of a general point, is that I think people always have a mindset, those in the sort of community who are advocating for immigrant rights and for the immigrant community overall, that the problem stops with the Republican Party, right? I think it's a general assumption that it's only the Republican Party that is at fault for the reason why we don't have immigration reform, or that we are so harsh towards immigrants. Marc, you mentioned it earlier. Bill Clinton, right, a Democratic president, was very harsh when it came to the immigrant community. The reason why states have such an issue trying to pass different laws to expand access to in-state tuition, to state aid for undocumented immigrants who are just trying to get a college education, which is becoming a requirement for many jobs in this country, or well-paying jobs, quote unquote, when you think of well-paying, is because of President Clinton's reform bills during his presidency that shut the door on that and made it even harder for immigrants to have access to different public services and benefits that are necessary at times. I know people try and categorize it as a Republican issue, especially when Trump was in office. We covered the news about the public charge finally being dropped, and that was definitely terrible policy, right? Horrible policy that affected so many people, especially when you consider COVID. People lost their jobs, so a lot of immigrants here with authorization who were with a legal status to be in this country, they were being punished because if they lost their job, they needed to depend on some kind of public resource to survive and take care of their families, and yet they would be punished for doing something that is within their rights. That was already difficult to do in the first place. So yes, Republicans, I think the one thing I can appreciate about the Republican Party is that they're very upfront about how much they hate immigrants, so you don't have to be surprised when they come out with a lot of these policies or legislation that are very restrictive towards the immigrant community, especially as we become more partisan and divided, and especially along the lines of immigration. But it's not to give a pass to the Democratic Party for what they've done over the past couple of years, decades rather. Or whether you go to the immediate example of Bill Clinton, or even under Obama, for how many deportations he did under his presidency, and just in general, really not fighting as hard for the immigrant population, which helped in large part to give him not just his first presidency, but his second presidency. So really is, why do party politics clash? Well, it's not so cut and dry, and not always so obvious right out the gate, I would say. Republican Party, don't have to be surprised there, but even the Democrats, one of you mentioned earlier, I believe it was you, Jamin, correct me if I'm wrong, about this stimulus check, right, and how it kept getting watered down. That wasn't the Republican Party doing that, right? They didn't have power for that, to do that. It was moderates, and they're not really moderate, because to be in a moderate position means that you're in line with the average American voter, but they're not, right? American voters supported this check. They supported some relief from COVID, something that they need right now. And yet, what's his name? Is it Manchin, or who was yeah, correct. Yeah, okay, good. I'm surprised I got that correct off the top of my head. But he is, he claims to be a moderate Democrat, but he has already said going forward, he's not going to vote for any legislation or any reform unless it has at least one Republican vote. That is one of the worst stances I've ever heard, because you do not have bipartisanship anymore. If you see over the years, there's a clear trend that this idea, this myth of bipartisanship has now kind of flown away. It's sailed off into the horizon, never to be seen again, because it's not possible anymore. You need to have two parties in good faith, and that doesn't exist in Congress. And so going forward, I'm not surprised if this is sort of the apex of the Biden administration, and nothing is really going to come out except for the low-hanging fruit, which is my issue with the notion of the piecemeal approach that our representatives are trying to take, namely Democrats, that they want to help Dreamers because it's, again, very, very popular. They want to help TPS holders, which is, again, great. I don't mind it, and I think they need support as well, especially if they can't return home. I think it's perfectly fine. But as an excuse to say, we've done our part, we don't need to do any more, the rest of you can kind of just do your best and don't get in trouble, or we're going to get rid of you. That's the baseline message that I get. And it is, again, it's this narrative of the deserving immigrant, the ideal immigrant who doesn't commit crime, who is more educated than the general population of the US, and who is always working, always employed, always benefiting the country as a whole. And that's not realistic when you look overall throughout the country. People are suffering, and it's really hard to expect many of these things going forward, especially if they're going to use the time period with COVID within their requirements for especially the employment side. When you look at these laws, they require that you sustain employment for like 75% of any authorization you have if you had DACA or you had some kind of work permit. So I think it definitely is a big piece along that perfect immigrant narrative. And again, I think you mentioned it slightly earlier, Marc, about this idea of sort of Americans first versus the outsiders, the people who aren't of this country, and just a preference for the American citizen, which, to an extent, I can understand, right? Because you do want to take care of your citizens, but definitely you don't want to slam the door on people and say, all right, now get out, even if they've been helping to keep this country alive and grow its economy over time. As we've seen throughout American history, has depended heavily on immigrants and their labor and their services to really the elites of this country. So maybe to now, I'd say I can also go on little tangents and rants, but to kind of wrap this up, I do want to maybe take it into a bit of a more practical side, since the two of you are state coordinators, right, with the Washington People's Party. Correct me if I'm wrong, the Washington People's Party is very close to being more formalized in the states, and then eventually, right, we'll hopefully be running some candidates in the future. So really, I want to understand, what can our state representatives do for immigration reform, right? We've already spoken about how it's relevant to the state government, that it can be a very complex topic and sometimes not too straightforward. It shouldn't be an issue, but representatives can make it into an issue. But what can our state representatives do to support immigration reform in the country? Maybe starting with you, Marc, if you want to kick it off, and then I'll send it over to Jamin right after.
Sure. It's tough. It's a difficult issue because state governments are not financially sovereign entities like the federal government is. So we, as state governments, do need to balance their budgets. They do need to consider their tax incomes. So, the first thing that we, and I'm going to talk about Washington, but any state this would apply, less regressive tax structures will always be beneficial. Focusing on the least supported in our society. Because ultimately, the racism and the exclusivity of our nationalism is about protecting those who own stuff right now. It's about protecting capital. So preferencing our state policies, preferencing our state tax income to stop extracting money from the lowest working classes, from the most oppressed among us, which absolutely includes our immigrant communities, obviously, right? If our tax structure pulls its primary funds from the wealth and from the capital classes as opposed to from the working classes, that will help. If we, as a state, decide to find ways to fund education that are more, let's not even talk about equitable, let's just talk about equal, right? If we were just to start prioritizing state dollars based on number of students, you just divide it equally so that there are no rich districts and poor districts. If everyone in our public education system, if all that money was pooled and divided per student, that would help the most disadvantaged, because wherever our immigrant communities happen to be in that public education system, they would get more money from it. If we deprioritize policing among our immigrant communities, so much of the ills in our current society have to do with our police state. And I don't want to distract this conversation about that. However, it's a conversation that needs to be had, and it's language so defines the way we think about things. And one of the beautiful things about being bilingual, which I am not, but because language helps define the way you think about things, if you can speak multiple languages, if you have the more words you have, the more thought pathways you have, the different ways you can think about things. So multilingual people, I think, are intrinsically able to think about things from multiple pathways. But going away from, back to police, and I get distracted. If you look at the word policing, right, it is about looking around to find what is out of place. And that is intrinsically at odds with welcoming multiple societies into our society, multiple cultures in our society. If the concept in our police state is you spend so much of your money, whether it's nationally, statewide, or locally, if you spend the greatest majority of your budget on looking for things that are out of place, you are by nature going to impact minorities, impact immigrants, impact everything that is different. And that is what our capital system wants. That is what the Democrats want. You talk so much about, we always talk about Republicans, and we tend to give Democrats a pass, but the fact is the Democrats lie. Now, there's so many young organizers in the immigrant community who have been working so hard for the last decade. And I feel so much hope from them about what could happen now that Democrats have anything. And so many of them are going to be so disappointed because the Democrats lie. They have told you for years that the Republicans are the reason that no change can happen. They have told you for the last 4 years Trump is the reason nothing can happen. They made 2020 all about Trump because they didn't want it to be about our system. They didn't want it to be about the status quo. Because if you realize that it is the system that they are a part of, like, they will tell you all the time as we go into these negotiations about Biden's reform, his pathway to citizenship, you will hear from people like Pelosi and Manchin and these Democratic leaders, well, we just can't pass it. And it's all lies. It's all gaslighting. All these people negotiate. I did a union negotiation for my contract. And the fact is, when you're in negotiations, you have two extremes that negotiate. That's what it means. That's how it works. Democrats know this. Negotiation is what they do. The reason they say, well, it can't pass, so we're not going to fight it, is because they don't want it. Every time you hear a Democrat say, we can't bring that up, it won't pass, what they mean is, we don't want it. If they wanted it, they would bring up the farthest left position they could, so that the far right positions would have to negotiate together. And they could bring up the examples that we are fighting for you. They're not going to do that because they do not want to help you. They are not on your team. They are on the team of money. You are someone that they want to exploit. You are someone they want to keep down, because keeping you down keeps the citizens they are also keeping down feeling really good about themselves. So they will keep supporting the people who are extracting the wealth from all of us. Sorry, I get worked up. I don't like.
That's perfectly fine.
We are as valuable as any one of those jerks who are sitting in the seats of power, making the decisions, taking the millions of dollars from the exploiters who are taking advantage of all of us, right? They don't care about any of us. They just want some of us to hate others of us so that they can take advantage of all of us. And until we stop that, and here's the thing, and here's what I hope that all the young organizers who've been fighting so hard for so many years realize, Democrats lie. And as long as you vote for them, they assume you support them. If you vote for a Democrat, everything they've done, you support. Period. Period. The way you hold them accountable, absolutely. You should call every day. Call your representative every day and tell them, I want you to support this bill. Right? And I mean literally call. That has putting a phone call and talking to a staffer has more weight than 1,000 tweets. It has more weight than 100 emails. A staffer will take a note and they will physically go to your representative and say, these people care about these things. It is the most valuable thing you can do to try to hold their feet to the fire right now. But in election season, the most valuable thing you can do is vote for somebody else, because only when they lose will they change. Why has there been such a huge verbal support of the anti-Trump policies? Is because they wanted to get elected. And now that, but they did not expect to get the Senate. They did not expect to get all three. They desperately, you hear people like Pelosi say, we need Republicans. They do. They need a spoiler. They need a bad guy so that you keep voting for their bosses, which are the ones with the money. It ain't us.
Thank you for that, Mark. I think passion is always a great thing. So, no, definitely thank you. And I agree. I think that it's definitely a game of politics where, unfortunately, the people who do lose out when this game is played is typically the everyday worker, everyday person in the country, and especially immigrants who don't have as much of a protection as a citizen in this country. Jamin, do you have something to add on to? I imagine you
Yes.
do.
Yes, first and foremost, now you guys see who the pit bull in the Washington People's Party is. Just saying. So, and I also wanted to say, if you're not of an indigenous bloodline, we're all immigrants here, every single one of us. So I wanted to point that out as well. And I took a little excerpt that I wanted to read about how you can contact and move forward with, and it pretty much just doubles down to what Marc had said. If you are having problems with your immigration case, a member of the U.S. Congress may be willing to inquire with a federal immigration agency, such as U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, and the U.S. Department of State, DOS, on your behalf. So, like, your representatives, even though I cannot say that they always do what we want, that's how you make that voice. Just to second what Marc had said, call those people, stay on their butt, keep their feet to the fire. That's how we move things forward, just like the WPP is about to prove. We aren't going to let people walk away from the situations we have to talk about. So I encourage all of you, anything to talk to those representatives. That's what they're there for, is to be our voice and your voice as well.
Definitely agree. And that's why part of this campaign includes really trying to teach people how do you contact your representatives, right? Actually, the first step is how do you even find out who your representative is, right? Because you can't even contact your rep if you don't know who that is. So for those people who are interested, definitely we'll have some information running across the bottom once my tech support will put that up. It'll have, again, our website information where you have step-by-step instructions on how do you find out who your representative is, how do you find their contact information, right? So their direct number, their email or contact form, how you can send an email if you prefer. And then we also have a script or a guide that you can follow to format your email or when you're calling to have a good, clear idea of what you're asking them to do. And if always you're able to edit it and make it your own, throw in a personal story is also preferred. So it's a little bit more personal. But to the point that Marc brought up, and then you also seconded, Jamin, definitely, it's a matter of calling, and calling. They're forced to log our concerns, and then they're forced to act on it. I believe, especially when it comes to state and local politics, especially, no one calls. This is why there's so many issues, is that representatives then feel free to do really whatever it is. So even one phone call on an issue has so much priority because they're not used to receiving a phone call whatsoever. So there is power in people taking action, and it can have results. But when it comes to something like as big as immigration reform, especially when we're trying to fight for a pathway to citizenship for more than 11 million undocumented immigrants in this country, it requires more than just one phone call this entire month. It needs this everyday action over and over, really being in the ear of representatives at the federal level, but also at the state level, because these representatives are coming from a state. So if you're a state representative, you have influence and power over your constituents across the state, and so state representatives taking a stance, passing a resolution, sending out a public letter of support for immigration reform has significant value. And more importantly, is that they can actively go out to town halls, hold them, talk with people, convince the local everyday person in their constituency to also call. It's a domino effect. People who have more influence and power, they can reach out and get more people involved, more so than just maybe a normal everyday person who only knows their friends, families, close contacts. So I like you had mentioned it earlier, right, Mark, that it is a combination of the policies we can pass, right, whether it's policing or through education and funding immigrant communities to prepare them for future reform. But there's also practical ways that I think we can expect our representatives to take today, even to really motivate and inspire everyday people to get out and call and hold their federal representatives accountable, since the federal representatives are the ones who will have the actual physical vote on this bill. But we can definitely indirectly influence it, and we can expect our state representatives to also get involved that way. Now, we are running a little bit over, so I want to, typically we will have Q&A. I don't see any questions coming in, so that's perfectly fine. I'm also going to be speaking a little bit as if this is the future or past recording, but regardless, if anyone has questions in viewing this video, definitely leave it in the comments. I do review them. I come back to them, I do my research, and then I provide information either in a future video, or I'll reply right away if it's something very quick and easy to answer. So definitely feel free to do so down below. Now, to kind of start wrapping up, I do want to give the two of you just a chance real quick if you want to quickly promote the Washington People's Party or the MPP in general. Feel free to do so. I leave it up to two of you to kind of figure out who would like to have at it to promote the party. Go for it, Mark.
I'll mute myself now. We at the Movement for a People's Party, we're working on building a new major party of the people, where people can finally be represented over money and over capital. If you'd like to join this movement, we are organizing nationwide. We are registered in Maine and Colorado and California. Maine and California, you can register as a People's Party. Colorado, we are collecting signatures. Oregon, we are collecting signatures. Ohio, we are collecting signatures. Peoplesparty.org is how you would sign up to that. The Washington People's Party, we are on both Facebook and Twitter. I don't do social media, so I don't actually know the handles of those. But look up Washington People's Party. And more importantly, get involved. Whether you want to get involved in the People's Party, whether you want to get involved in DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, or the Green Party, or even in the Democrats. And I want to give a shout out to Nevada DSA and what they did taking over the state party in Nevada. Power to you. I think you will be disappointed. I think that the DNC is going to spend the next few years demonizing you and blaming you for everything that went wrong. But if you feel tired of government supporting dollars over workers, businesses over you, get involved. Get involved in politics. It doesn't have to be our party. It just has to be someone who's getting involved and working to change and make your community better. Thank you so much. I appreciate being here, Nuno.
And I will jump in and say the same thing. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and learn about this, because it wasn't something on the forefront of my mind, because, you know, I don't have to live with this. But then looking at this and preparing for these questions, it really opened my mind to the fact of what immigrants go through and what the process is like, and how backwards it really is, and everything it supports, all those people that support that. It's just, it's a horrible situation. So us joining together in solidarity, like Marc said, all of us working together. It don't matter if you're DSA, if you're People's Party, I don't care who you are. All of us working together is the only way these problems will be solved. I would like to give a shout out to just the People's Party for giving me this opportunity, Nuno for giving me the opportunity to speak to other people and voice situations just like this, scenarios just like this. It's amazing. Even being an old knucklehead, we still out here gonna fight. And the bottom line is to make this world better for my daughter, for all children for that matter. And that's why I'm here. So thank you again for the opportunity, and I hope that we open some minds and some eyes.
Perfect. And yeah, again, I will want to extend a thank you again for the two of you accepting the invite to be on here. I think it's always great to have more voices being heard outside of just the typical established political party. So definitely thank you for being here. Now, to just quickly wrap up, I do want to, again, mention to people that there's things that you can do to take action. I kind of put this off. Usually it's early in the program, but to take action, if you're interested, there's the website scrolling across the bottom. It is citizenship2021.org/action. It has the different ways that you can take action now, whether it is contacting your representative, whether it is sharing your story, or even signing our petition, which is now close to 6,100 signatures. So again, amazing job to all of you for your support on that. But I do want to highlight again, it's important to call or email your U.S. representatives. This number here is the number to the congressional switchboard. So this is a general number where, as long as you know your representative's name, you just have to say you want to talk with them, and they will directly connect you to their office number, where then you can leave your message in support of the U.S. Citizenship Act, immigration reform in general, or if you are interested in supporting the upcoming bills, again, the American Dream and Promise Act of 2021, or the Farm Workforce Modernization Act of 2021. Either one is perfectly fine, although I would encourage for the comprehensive reform of the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021. But again, visit our website, because you will have the step-by-step. How do you find the name of your representative? It's very easy, very straightforward, less than 3 minutes to find out their name. And then if you want to call them directly, you can also find their number. So definitely do that. If you want to sign our petition, although we're doing pretty well, still we need a lot more signatures. Very simple to find it, change.org/citizenship2021. With that out of the way, again, I want to thank our guests for really this great conversation. I think it's an amazing thing to really think about how our state governments really interact with immigration reform, since we always think about it as a federal issue, but it's becoming very, very clear now that it extends well beyond that into our everyday lives. So thank you again. If you want more information, I'm going to quickly put up that information for the party one more time, scrolling on the bottom there. Visit peoplesparty.org if you want to join the People's Party. They'll have ways of getting you involved throughout the country. So it's not just in the state of Washington. It is a national movement. Or you can follow them on social media at Washington People's Party if you want to get involved with the Washington People's Party. Otherwise, I believe it's also similar, People's Party, something along those lines for the national movement. Regardless, as always, thank you for joining us. And I'm going to ask our guests just to stay on a little bit. We're going to move over to the back room, have a small conversation. But for everyone else, thank you again. If you're watching this post live, you'll have some recommendations popping up on the screen. Feel free to watch any of our other videos, any of our past live sessions. But we are always here Saturdays and Sundays. Saturdays are in English, Sundays in Spanish at 1:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, or 4:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So definitely check us out going forward. And thank you as always, and goodbye.
Thank you so much.